All right, hey Nick, what's up, everyone? We're gonna have this new beginner series where right now our aim is to call this, or the current title that we have is Poker Reverse Engineered, teaching your mom how to play poker. So
Nice.
welcome, Nick. Why don't you just share just a quick like 2-3 line summary about yourself?
Sure. I'm Nick Howard. I coach professional poker and also play. Um, Probably most of you would know me from my time spent with Run At Once, but since then, I've started my own training company at Poker Detox, and I've been doing that ever since.
All right, and so for this series, what would you think is the most relevant for new players to learn in poker first?
The first thing, I think a lot of the misconceptions that come from playing poker, especially trying to play at a higher level, stem from misunderstanding the basics. So I think it's pretty clear when talking to a bunch of players that most guys don't really grasp the concept of EV. So it's probably a good starting point. I mean, you could really talk about it for a long time, I think, but if done correctly, I think we can lay down a groundwork for the best way to grasp EV from within um, the entry point of being a new player to poker who's trying to get better at poker. There's a lot of advanced concepts of EV that become more relevant as time goes on, but really the fundamentals I think are the most important, and a lot of people still don't really get them, even at higher levels, which is what's really interesting. So that would be my main thing. If you don't understand the basics of EV, it will block you from ever getting very good. And you see this happen sometimes where good players would be able to be better players if they spent more time understanding the basics.
So how about let's do this. You give a definition, your definition that you think most clearly describes EV, and then I'll do the same, and then we can kind of form a little bit of a comparison, and hopefully, because we explain things in a different way,
Sure.
so
And that's,
more people can understand it.
yeah, I agree. I was going to say it's good. Like there might not actually be a perfect definition for EV. It's best that it gets explained in a bunch of ways and people can kind of latch on to the one that makes the most sense. So yeah, let's try to give a couple different relatively accurate definitions of EV. I'll go. Um, for me, the way that I understand EV, it always sort of hinges around an idea of zero EV first.
Sorry,
So
sorry. Maybe I need to interrupt here. Like I realized that a lot of people don't even know that EV is
yeah,
expected.
expected
Let's
value.
go down simpler into that.
So if we're looking at expected value on a sliding scale, my mind always wants to start from, well, what is the neutral point? That would be a zero expected value play. That would mean that for you to take a certain action is neither profitable nor losing. It is just zero EV. It is equal, break even. So if we
What's a
use that
simple
as,
example to describe that?
say again,
What's a simple example or analogy to describe that?
folding would be zero EV. Because if I fold my hand, I cannot lose or make money in that action zone. It's just a simple pass almost. I'm passing on the play. So from there, the point of assessing EV is to try to pick the most profitable option at any given point. So over the course of the hand, you'll be facing what is called decision points. That's when you have an option to fold, check, raise, bet. And you're always sort of cycling through your options, trying to find what is the highest EV play. We're looking for positive expected value plays as poker players. Generally, you could say that the poker player that avoids more negative expected value plays is probably the better poker player. I think that would be a pretty good rule of thumb.
Oh, so you go for making less minus EV plays instead of making big plus EV plays as a focus point.
Yeah, I actually heard this from Phil Galfond a long time back, and I thought it was way too simple the way he said it. But it's a really good, simple way of putting it that if you're going to just sum up what makes a good player is not making many negative EV decisions. He's more making positive EV decisions. That makes sense. I think it's a good starting point.
All right. So I'll go next. I would say that my description of expected value is so if somebody wanted to understand expected value, the first thing that I would do is talk about a game of red or black or a coin flip. If we bet $1 on heads, it returns an expected value of 0 because 50% of the time, our $1 will return us $2. So we bet $1 and we win $1. So we are positive $1, and the other half of the time we'll lose that $1. So if we bet on either side of heads or tails, that is a neutral EV or zero EV. And in poker's context, because whenever you fold, you have no chance to win the pot. So it's always zero EV. And in the sense of like the difference between folding in poker and a game of coin flip is that coin flip, there's a probability that we win and the probability that we lose. For this instance, it's a 50-50 chance. Whereas for the game of poker, when we fold, we always get zero EV because it's absolute. There's no way we can win.
Good point.
If we kind of take the coin flip concept into poker, what will happen is that a spot where we have absolute 50-50 based on, let's say, I don't know exactly what spots are exactly 50-50 in poker because maybe it's like a little bit close. But let's say pocket twos versus ace king is like 50.4 and 49.6, for example. I don't know if that's accurate, but if that was accurate, then when a zero EV play would be when there's no money in the pot and I could bet $49.4 in order to win $100 in total. So if I had ace king and you had pocket deuces, I put $49.40, and then you put $50.60, we would both be making a zero EV play in poker. So in regards to how expected value would translate into us being good poker players that make as many plus EV decisions. Plus EV means positive expected value, so your EV is more than 0, and negative EV is basically when you have a negative expected value. So you're on average, if like I'm putting $50, but I only take back 49.4 in the long run, I have a minus 60 cents worth of EV. So in poker, it is to carve out and find the spots where you are actually plus EV, or avoid the spots that you make minus EV decisions. So that's
and I think it'd be useful to just discuss briefly what would create a minus EV decision. If folding cannot be negative EV by definition, I think everybody should be able to get that kind of intuitively. You're not taking an action, you're not making an investment, therefore you couldn't lose money on the play. Then what creates negative EV is when you make an investment and it's a losing investment on average. So in order to have a negative EV play, we would have to be putting money into the pot. So really what we're trying to avoid as poker players is putting money into the pot at the wrong times, basically. That's all I really wanted to do there is tie that little loose end up, because I think it's helpful for people to see that as a starting point, you will never be able to lose money in a single decision point just by folding. That will always be neutral EV. It could still be a mistake if your hand had plus EV to continue, but it will never appear to be zero EV when you look at the calculation of it. So.
Yeah, I think the common misconception is that some people think that some spots folding is minus EV, and the actual minus EV decision that they made is probably on an earlier street. So if the flop fold is considered minus EV, it's actually the pre-flop call that was probably minus EV. And
many times I would say, yeah.
They're probably thinking of EV in a relative scale instead of an absolute scale. So, and by our definition of expected value, it is an absolute scale, and I think it should always be an absolute scale. It's kind of tricky when we start using expected value as a relative scale, because that's not the definition of expected value. So that's a misconception that I'd like to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Um, and I'm not sure the poker community has done a good job of distinguishing that, because a lot of times what can happen is you can make a zero EV play by folding, but you actually had a plus EV investment zone. So you could have made a call or a raise that was positive EV. In that sense, your zero EV fold was negative EV relative to calling or raising, but we still wouldn't necessarily classify it as negative EV in absolute terms. It's negative EV relative to the better option. So that's just a little twist that becomes important to recognize as you get better. But I think the definition as it stands is pretty good, which is just that EV should be described in absolute terms, at least as an introduction, in order to avoid unnecessary complication and just to get that fundamental groundwork laid down that we are trying to avoid negative EV investment zones. We will never be able to lose money when we don't make an investment, therefore it's zero EV, and we're really trying to find positive EV investment zones. That's probably the most macro poker strategy outline that we could start with. So I think it's a good start.
All right. So just for the sake of, I think you're significantly better than me at explaining topics at a very, very deep level. I think that maybe I am better off, like if we were to discuss a concept like expected value, I would say that we probably benefit the listeners more by me actually describing a more like wide net kind of description first, and then you spotting where I'm kind of missing out.
Agreed. I agree. And I think it's a symptom of me being so deep in the rabbit hole that because when you're very, very far into the nuances of something, it's more difficult, I think, to come back and make the very large, simple circle out of it. So yeah, I appreciate the balancing aspect of that, because funny enough, one of the reasons I wanted to do this with you is because I knew that coming back to the basics of it would actually strengthen my understanding of the very nuanced zones. Somehow that's always how it works is, we might get into that one example that I really loved that I was talking to you about away from the table here, but that one simple example that you used that I said, oh, we've got to talk about this, because even though this appears so simple, it goes so deep. You can take it so far into the advanced territory and it's still very helpful. So we'll probably get to that. I don't want to spoiler it, but I agree. And I appreciate the balance of getting back to a simpler context.
Yeah, so let's jump to that on this call as well, but like maybe the second half of this call. For now, let's stick to expected value. And
Sure.
I think that a lot of people tend to benefit from having actual implementable strategies. So maybe we can just kind of like, I'll go first and you can think about it while I'm talking. Maybe we can go for like 1 to 3 ways that people can understand expected value more deeply in a very, very practical sense.
Okay.
So I would say that I'll go first. My first one is probably to have a bit of a basic understanding of prisoner's dilemma. It's a game theory concept that just talks a lot about payoff, that certain actions get certain payoffs. And in the context of poker, every decision that we make has a payoff sometimes it's very hard to pinpoint the absolute payoff because of uncertainty regarding how other players play. But for example, if we were to simplify the model based on pre-flop, and then let's say when we reach the flop, it's always based on equity. So the game ends on the flop. I probably need to explain a little bit more about that just to make it a little bit simpler. So what will happen is that if I have pocket twos and you had ace king, then I have slightly more than 50%. And if the game ended on the flop, then all of the expected value and the way that we think pre-flop would relate to how much equity that we have. So equity of hands would be where I have 50.4%, you have 49.6%, or something along that lines. And understanding that each action has a specific payoffs, even though I'm not being very accurate with the payoffs now, I think it's a great place to start as my number one. Why I said prisoner's dilemma is that prisoner's dilemma is like gives you a decision tree, a 2x2 decision tree that shows you that, hey, if you make this decision based on what your opponent could make, whether he would tell on you or he would keep the secret, or in poker maybe the decision is to call or to fold, you get a different payoff regarding you personally get a different payout. So you could get if you make your opponent fold, for example, you could get a payoff of 1. And if your opponent calls, maybe you get a payoff of -1. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say is probably to use a simulator tool like Pro Poker Tools or Poker Stove, one of those that lets you see how hands play against each other pre-flop. Because understanding equity is very important when it comes to understanding expected value. Equity and expected value, they're not the same thing. The difference is that equity is the raw amount of equity that we have. So on a certain flop, let's say we are on the river, the equity is always 100 and 0. The best hand always has 100% equity. The worst hand always has a 0% equity. But on an earlier street, because there are cards left to come, if I had 2 outs left, my equity for that hand, I would have about approximately 4%, and the other person would have about 96%. But sometimes the equity, if I only have 2 outs, then the other person can just always bet a big enough size that I can never ever realize my 4% of the equity. So my expected value in that spot is usually going to be 0. So that would be how I tie equity and expected value. Maybe like you might also explain equity a little bit like later on, because I think equity is very, very closely tied to understanding expected value. So I'll just stop at these two for now and maybe let you elaborate.
Yeah, I can help here, I think. So I want to start with what you mentioned about equity sort of being, I would refer to it in the terminology of hot and cold. So hot and cold is a term of if there was no further betting or streets, no more cards to come and no more betting, EV would collapse onto equity. Equity would collapse into EV. So they would become the same at the point at which there's no more progression in the hand. And that can be... Yeah, go ahead.
The difference is that EV is usually in dollar value. Equity is usually in percentage terms.
Yeah.
So that's the difference.
So that's important. And so if we had 50% equity on a $100 pot with no future action and no more cards to come, our EV is 50. It's important to see the relationship between them. What makes EV start to stand apart from equity more than anything is the fact that we have the option to take multiple different strategy options at any given decision point. We can bet, we can check, we can fold, and there's also streets to come. And when a different card comes, it changes the equities. So equity is shifting with more cards to come, and the way we utilize our equity based on whether or not we choose to bet, check, or fold affects EV. It's important to understand that, because otherwise you're going to be walking around with a very absolute, rigid notion of equity. It is the starting point, but there are structures embedded into the game, like multi-streets, like the option to bet, raise, or call, the option to pick your bet sizing. All of these have an impact on the hot and cold original equity of the hand. But I would say it's useful to see the starting point as the raw equity of the situation, because it's usually a pretty good indicator of who has better EV, at least on early streets. Pre-flop would be a good example of this. The player who played
that to somebody that has never played poker before. I think
at the beginning. So at the beginning, we want to focus on playing hands that, when combined, have a higher. If there was no dead pot, and we'll get into that, the initial place that we should be putting our attention is on playing hands that have more equity than our opponent. That would be a good starting point, because that would ensure that over the course of all possible actions that could ensue, we're probably going to be in a favorable position to produce positive EV outcomes. Dead pot complicates things, though. And whenever you want to get into that, I'm all ears.
How would people understand which hands have higher equity?
I would advise to use Equilab as a starting point. PokerStove, Equilab, anything where you can plug in a certain hand and run it against another hand, or plug in a range of hands and run it against a range of hands. It's a good way to start to calibrate.
So what examples would you use, and like how would you recommend somebody start this process? What would you show a new player if you had to run them through Equilab?
I think what you could do is pick a series of very simple examples. In theory, we'd call them almost toy game examples of the comparison of equity, again, between two single hands or a few hands versus a few hands. I find it best to really play around with that process. I don't think there's any real one way that works for anyone. I think the way that a student actually learns is when he plays with it enough that he picks a certain pattern that for some reason makes a connection in his mind, and then he starts to make his own benchmarks through that. So a lot of it is just sort of playing with the program and beginning to calibrate based on your own intuition, which you eventually turn into some patterns that get integrated. I wouldn't pick too rigid of a format for that. I think it's important that the student plays with a program like that.
Got it. All right. I think let's leave the equity here for now, and let's jump into the date pot game. That would also help people understand equity and EV a lot better. So I guess I'll start and I'll go by giving the brief summary of how we decided to talk about this topic. So I was thinking a lot, like, what is, if we had to break poker down to first principles, what is really the objective of the game in poker? So I started thinking, hey, there are blinds in the game. So is poker about fighting for the blinds and stealing the blinds? So stealing the blinds mean that we are raising in order to steal the dead money in the pot. So blinds are basically just dead money in the pot. What happens if we remove blinds and antes and there are no blinds in the game at all? So the example here would be that me, you, and let's say 4 other people, we're playing 6-handed and there are no blinds in the game. What would happen in the game? How would, game theory wise, how would, like, let's say like we started off with a very random strategy. Like I started off raising the best 50% of possible hands in poker from the first position. What would the next person do? And how would we keep playing and against each other, trying to exploit, which means to try and take the maximum, most positive EV line against the other person until all 6 of us reach an equilibrium. So I started playing around with the idea, and then I thought about it, like, why not we just go to the very end of the spectrum first and try it there? If I was only raising pocket aces here, because if there's no money left in the pot, I have nothing to fight for. So if I only go all in with aces, I could only either take down the pot, which means that my EV is 0, or I could win money when somebody else calls. So it's a guaranteed spot where I would have a expected value of 0 or a positive expected value, depending on my opponent's strategy. So that's where I would start.
And I would just clarify there that there is no dead pot in this situation. So if he responds accurately, which would always be to fold, your EV will be 0 because you just take down the hand with no dead pot. So really that's, I think what this comes down to is if we played this game out without a dead pot, we would get to a point where everybody at the table would realize that they don't have any reason to enter a hand without the best hand in the game. And that might sound actually overly simple, but it's a product of no player having incentive to ever put money in behind, because at any time where they do that, they're just going to find out that they're causing their opponent to play an even stronger hand. If you take this process to completion, you end up with one player or all players only be incentivized to play the nutted hand, the pocket aces hand. So it's interesting to look at it because you could start at different points And in theory, we call this iterating. If we iterated this game to completion, we would end up at a point where nobody wanted to play anything except pocket aces.
Let's give an example so that people can understand, and let's kind of play back and forth a little bit. So let's say that we just take a very simple toy game example of me and you playing a game of poker, right? So let's say that me and you are playing and there's no dead money in the pot. So I start with playing a range that looks like, let's just say top 50%, which so for people that might not be clear about what top 50% means, it means that the best 50% of hands equity-wise or playability-wise, okay, the best 50% that will generate the maximum positive expected value for me. So if I start by raising these hands against you, even though there's not any dead money in the pot, how will you iterate this into your best strategy against mine? We don't need to be super accurate, but just rough framework of how we go about it.
Without a dead pot, I should never be putting money into the pot with a range that is weaker than yours. I think that's the accurate answer to that. If you're going to play a certain combination of hands, I got to make sure that without a dead pot, my combinations of hands have the same strength. So I think I would play an identical range to you without a dead pot.
So, but playing an identical range to me would mean that we both have zero expected value, right? And if you only played a stronger range than me, you would generate positive expected value. So it will reach an equilibrium where you maximize your positive expected value by playing slightly tighter than me. That's what would happen.
One unit tighter than you, whatever that is.
Yeah. So if I play 50%, maybe it could be 1 unit tighter, and it could be more units tighter as well, because but likely it's only 1 unit, because that 1 unit tighter than me would generate a very, very minuscule positive expected value.
This is a good point. I would probably have more incentive if I really wanted to punish you for opening top 50% to play something substantially tighter than 50%. And that way, maybe I cause your weakest 20% to lose even more, at which point you would realize that, and then you would tighten up, and we'd go through this motion until you didn't play anything except pocket aces and I didn't play anything except pocket aces.
Yeah, okay, so the simple example here for people to conceptualize this would be that if I was only playing queens, kings, and aces right now, right, your counter strategy would be to play kings and aces probably.
Yeah.
Because kings is probably break even against aces, kings, and queens. So you will only play aces?
Close. Yeah, it's 50% EV, I think. Well, it's not quite that because the other guy could have kings, but yeah, that's a good starting point.
It is 50% because, well, it depends on whether aces beats kings by more EV or kings beats queens by more EV. So
and whether or not he can have kings, because sometimes
kings is just break even, so it doesn't change anything.
So if he basically had all three simultaneously, we could figure out the equity of kings to be able to plug it into this equation. But close this loop now, because I think I'm sensing that you want to drag in what happens now when we insert a dead pot. So maybe describe the simplest entry point for how that changes things.
I'd say that the simplest entry point is when there is just both of us are forced to ante. So antes are when, so the difference between antes and blinds, let's do that description first, is that blinds are live in a way. So if I put a small blind and you put a big blind, if let's say we do it in actual dollar terms, we're playing $5, $10, I put $5 and you put $10. Now we can only go all in or fold. If I put $100, if we both started with $100, I only have to compete with 95 more, and you have to compete with 90 more. So that the money in front of us is live, like it counts towards the maximum amount that we need to put in the pot. Antes, on the other hand, are when the money is dead in the pot. So if the bet is $100, it doesn't matter what the ante is, we have to come up with $100 to put it into the pot. So the simplest way would be when there are antes, which actually just means that there are dead money in the pot.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we are playing this aces, kings, and queens game, and there is dead money in the pot, or we are both forced to ante. What will happen here is probably that now we have more incentive to fight over the pot, or we definitely have incentive to fight over the pot, because right now if we only play aces here, then the other person is always gonna take down the pot when we don't have aces. So we start loosening up our range, which means that we add in more hands that we play. So loosening up your range means that instead of just playing aces, we start playing kings and queens as well.
Mm-hmm. Essentially, we can make more hands profitable now that there is a bonus. I almost view the dead pot as sort of a bonus. We no longer need to have as much equity, you could say, to start off as in a zero dead pot equation, because now both players are sort of being cushioned by the existence of the dead pot. Both players now have incentive to play slightly looser because they have a portion of the dead pot that they're entitled to. And that, I guess in the simplest way, loosens things up a bit. It's what makes the game fun, really, because now we start to have a wider range of playable hands pre-flop for both players, which allows you to basically have more investment spots. Otherwise, it would be a very, very boring game without the dead pot.
Yeah, so the example that I'll use to describe how a dead pot game really changes things. And the reason I use this example because the small blind and big blind game of poker is the most common one that people generally face. So if we were playing a three-handed game, so I'm on the button, and then there's a small blind, and then there's a big blind. And let's say small blind, he always has a bad hand. Just use this simple example first. And then right now I'm on the button. I have a hand that is slightly worse than your hand on the big blind. So I have ace king and you have a pocket pair. So you are leading me slightly. In a non-dead pot game or non-blinds or non-ante game, I will always have to fold my two overcuts, my ace king against your pocket twos, because my expected value is less than zero. My equity is less than 50%, so my expected value is less than zero. But now, assuming that the blinds are big enough to compensate for that 0.x% that I lose out in equity, or that the expected value of the blinds is higher than the expected value that the blinds add to the pot is higher than the amount I lose to you in expected value by having a weaker hand than you, would be that bonus that would allow me to play my hand. And that's what drives the game of poker, because there's always an incentive to play more than raw 50% equity hand both sides.
Right. And without going too far off on this branch, I think it's important at that point to say that the result of that for the pocket deuces hand is that dynamic of introducing a dead pot has allowed pocket deuces to increase its EV versus ace king. Because now ace king has the incentive to put the money in because it has a portion of the dead pot that it's entitled to that counteracts its equity disadvantage. But pocket deuces is also very happy about this because now pocket deuces gets a portion of its bet. It collects EV off of a portion of its bet when ace king calls. Deuces very much prefers ace king having a reason to come into the pot, and that reason is supplied by the dead pot.
So the dead pot in a way is a bonus or a present, like somebody else.
I like this.
Put it into there, and now we have that extra money for us to share, but we share it based on our equity. So if the dead pot is an extra $100 and you had 51% and I had 49%, then let's say we both had $1,000 in our stack, how much of that $100 would we share each person? Like, what would be our share? So this
490 and 510 or something.
No, I
if
don't.
If we chopped it, I mean.
Yeah, okay. So if we chopped it, it would be that I have 49. So if the dead pot has $100, I would take 49 and you would take 51. But what if we had $1,000 each? Then what would happen is that we would both have to go all in, and then my expected value would be 49% of so I'll just do some math here. It'll be 49% times 2100 because we both have 1,000 each and there's 100 money in the pot.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be, the pot would be $2,100 and I will get 49% of that. So my expected value is 1,029 for my 1,000 invested. So I'm positively, I have a plus EV of $29, which means that your share is actually $71, which is quite interesting. And this is probably how people can understand the difference between expected value and raw equity. So if we chop the pot based on raw equity, it would be that I get 49 and you get 51. But expected value, because we both have to commit our stack, changes the equation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, it causes a new relationship where the hand that has the higher equity actually benefits more from there being a dead pot in play.
Yeah. And to be honest, like, it's kind of like when I describe it this way, I feel like I'm having a little bit of a breakthrough myself that the higher equity hand actually generates significantly more EV than the lower equity hand, even in this simple situation where it's like the pot is only a 10% of our stack, and
right.
It changes things a lot.
Well, this is why I really love always revisiting like foundational concepts, because like I said at the beginning, there are so many angles through which you can kind of look through that window, and you never know which one is gonna actually open up a new breakthrough for you. And I think like this is the most fascinating thing to me, is that as you continue to get better, you'll go through stages in your career where the framework through which you understand simple things, even like equity and EV, shifts. And if you're doing it right, if you're learning intelligently, it's shifting in a way that makes it more easy for you to navigate and also gain more accuracy at the same time. So you'll notice if you stay with poker that the lens through which you see it develops over time, and that's a good thing, because it gives you more versatility as a thinker and a player.
So my question for you here would be that how will you describe this relation between a no blinds game, no dead pot, and a dead pot, so that somebody that is new to poker can benefit maximally from this distinction that we are talking about?
I like this analogy of viewing the dead pot as a present. It's a present because it allows both sides more opportunity to make plus EV decisions. So in that sense, it's kind of an equal present for both sides. But we could also say that the player who has the range advantage or the equity advantage, just speaking strictly in a single street model, he kind of gets the better end of this bonus because he gets to use the dead pot to generate value or EV production in the form of value betting, which wasn't previously a possibility when the dead pot wasn't there. Remember the pocket aces example. If I have pocket aces, which is an equity advantage hand, and there's no dead pot, my opponent always folds. I can't get value. The dead pot allows the stronger hand to actually produce or generate EV through betting. And I think that would be the starting point without getting into ranges and how to balance bluffs. That's a very crucial understanding to have in terms of the total or absolute effect of what the dead pot does in terms of changing dynamics. It is the first thing that starts to allow for EV production to take place through polarizing. which I don't know if you want to introduce that term yet, but that is probably the next most crucial term to go into. And maybe we just give a base definition. Polarizing is basically, in simplest terms, I would say it's when you split your range into a value and bluffing component on a bet.
So I would say that
go
the
ahead.
more so how I would describe polarizing so that it is completely accurate would be so if me and you are in a game, then you always had a hand. So if I'm polarizing, I'm splitting my range and I'm only betting with parts where I either have zero equity against you or 100% equity against you. So that's pure polarization. And in a single street game, so if we're on the river, it means that I either have the worst hand or the best hand. And I start betting these two spectrums so that the basis of this is so that I can generate expected value from the pot. Because so if you think about it, when I have a hand that is better than you, I always want to be betting this hand because there's a chance that you would call. And if you call, I can gain money. And if I'm only betting good hands or hands better than you, then you would never call. So I can't generate any money at all. So if that's the case, then I can start introducing a really bad hand that's worse than yours. And then if I have 100 good hands and one bad hand, then what will happen is that even though I'm bluffing with that one hand, like 1 out of 101 times, you still can't call. So I can keep including bluffs in my polarized range, which means into my bluffing range until we reach an equilibrium where you can actually start calling and it makes no difference to you. I don't know if that's too deep of an explanation, but I
think it ties in well that equilibrium would actually be a zero EV situation for the player who was considering the bluff catch, which is relevant in the sense that it explains why it brings it back to the fundamental consideration of EV, which is we don't have incentive to invest if we are in a zero EV zone. So when EV is being produced by a polarizing range, the intention is to put the opponent to a zero EV decision. This is how indifference maximizes in a balanced equation. And there's a lot of math you could do behind that. And there's also simple ways that you could break it down to try to express it. One that I like is try to view what's happening in a dead pot game as you are forcing a threat with a certain amount of bluffs by using the bet size and the pot size to manipulate your opponent to a zero EV spot. And no matter what he does, the value component always supports you, always protects you from any one of his actions. So either your value will generate if he calls, or if he folds, your bluffs will now generate a share of the dead pot that you steal. And when you match that balance equation perfectly, which can be done by utilizing pot odds and bet sizing, you maximize your EV relationship. So that would be how the simple equity equation, no dead pot, turns into a equity dead pot for single street hands. And then we could even scale it to range versus range with a dead pot, where we're now polarizing with a bluffing component. That would sort of be the 3-stage progression of that.
Okay, I'd say that the simple way to explain polarization and how that works with no dead pot, first let's get that out of the way, is that if there was no dead pot and I was polarizing, so the example I'll use here is that we're on the river, the board is just small cards that don't really connect, and I have aces and queens, and you have pocket kings. Mm-hmm. So if there's no dead pot, I would always only bet with aces, and you would never ever call because there's no money in the pot. You can't call if I only have aces or queens, and I'm not gonna bet queens more often than I bet aces.
Well, you would never bet queens because you have no incentive to bluff. There's no dead pot.
Yes, exactly. But even if I included queens in my strategy, it makes no difference because I would be kind of, let's say we started off by betting everything. So I had one combination of aces, one combination of queens, and you had one combination of kings. I could bet queens or not bet queens, and it doesn't make a difference as long as
Right.
I'm betting ace. But that maybe complicates the model a little bit. So what happens now is that if we introduce a dead pot here into the game, what would happen is that so let's say I have, we will use a simple example of like the pot has $100 and I have $100 as well. You have $100. So we are now fighting for the pot of $100. And if I was betting only aces with $100 to steal that pot of $100, then you would never call steal because you're always gonna pay $100 and you never ever win any share of the pot.
Mm-hmm.
So what would happen now is that instead of me only betting aces, which I have 50% of the time, I will start betting with my queens as well. But the catch is that if I bet all of my queens, then now every time you call, you have a 50% chance of being correct. So your 50% chance of being correct means that you can generate a $50 plus EV decision by calling there. So since I have the polarized range, I want to be betting to the point where you calling or folding makes no difference to you. That would be the equilibrium point for me. So I would include betting queens a certain percentage of the time to make you indifferent. And so the math would look something like, if I bet aces first, then let's say you were to always fold. So I start including 0.1% of my queens. So now, instead of winning the pot, so I bet 10% of my queens. So instead of winning the pot 50% of the time, now I'm bluffing sometimes as well. So I win slightly more often than 50%. And we will slowly reach an equilibrium point where I am betting probably 2/3 of the time, because you need to be correct 1/3 of the time for you to break even with your call.
On a pot size bet, yeah.
Yeah. The reason is that there's $100 in the pot. If you are right 1/3 of the time when you're calling the $100, your return for your $100 is to win. Your expected value will be $100, which means that I would bet 2 aces is to half queens. So every time I see queens, I would maybe like run a random number generator and just bet 50% of the time. And that way, I'm stealing the pot 2/3 of the time. So I'm maximizing my expected value by reaching about 67%. So my EV would be $66.667.
Important to point out, I think, that the reason that the EV relationship for us is maximized when he's put to 0 EV or indifference is because that is the point at which he cannot improve against our strategy. So in theory, you're basically trying to find or create a balanced relationship through polarizing where the opponent cannot increase his EV. Because if he could, he would. And if he could, then he would. And if he could and would, then we wouldn't be at the final point of the iteration. So you would continue to keep changing strategies until he can improve his EV versus your strategy.
So if anybody is interested to dig deeper into this, the definition of game theory is usually a good starting point to dive deeper into this topic. Because when two parties at equilibrium points in a game theory sense, it becomes strictly their best decision if they cannot increase their expected value in any way. So in that situation where you are calling 1/3 of the time, if you caught a little bit more often than 1/3 or a little bit less than 1/3, you are losing some EV. So it means that if you lose EV, I gain EV. So that's the distinction I would point out here, which is kind of rephrasing what you're saying.
Yeah, and it reinforces that we really need to make sure we're not making negative EV plays. Because every time you make a negative EV play, it means you just handed your opponent more plus EV than he deserved, basically. So in this, maybe it's good to introduce this idea or concept of a zero-sum game. poker is a zero-sum game because anything that we do that is negative EV will be reflected in our opponent's positive EV. And any positive EV decision that we make is reflected as an opponent negative EV decision. So that's a good framework, I think.
So what happens now when we start including blinds into the game? How does that, like, what would be your way of describing how the blinds changes the game?
In a sense, I look at blinds and antes similarly in this, just in the sense that they create a dead pot dynamic, they create the pot odds dynamic. The blinds give the player who posts the blinds more incentive to play wider. This would be the main thing. So the player that has the big blind, not always, but generally, because of positional disadvantage, there's some exceptions, but he has better pot odds definitely than any other player at the table facing a raise. Whether or not he can actually play a wider range because of those pot odds is dependent on positional playability, which is a component. But for the most part, the fact that a blind is posted means the player who posts the blinds will be receiving better pot odds when facing a bet than a player who hadn't posted a blind. So it widens the range of playable hands, generally speaking. And it's the starting point. It's the initial present that allows everybody to sit down at the table and expect to be able to fight for something, to be able to expect to produce EV. Because if we didn't have the blinds or ante, we'd be back to the play only the pocket aces game. So in a sense, like maybe the most helpful thing to try to explain when we talk about the posting of the blinds is that is the initial point where players are incentivized to sit down at the table. Even that is the initial point where like there is something up for grabs to play for, and all of the manipulation that occurs post blind being posted, all of the navigating, all of the betting, that is to try to capture the maximum share of the dead blind, because it's not an option to post a blind. It's the penalty almost. It's the initial penalty assigned to the player in the unlucky seat who has to post the blind, and everybody will eventually post it, but it's not good to have to post a blind because you're basically surrendering a little present for everybody to fight for.
Yeah, so there are three things that I would like to add. The first is that if we only had to play this one hand of poker wasn't a game that the button passes on from player to player, right? For the players that are not posting the blinds are actually like a present, like what we talked about earlier. So everybody gets to generate a small positive expected value because there's the blinds in play. So this brings about to the second point, where basically if we think about a six-handed game, the big blind on average loses the most money every hand. The small blind loses the second most money every hand. And then the other four players will split a portion of their blinds in terms of positive expected value. So the example that I will use to describe here to tell you that under the gun will always be a winning player. Even if you're a really, really bad poker player and you don't know how to navigate post-flop, I have a winning strategy for you to play under the gun. The strategy is, if you have aces, go all in. If you don't have aces, you will not generate a large positive expected value, but you will always be plus EV, because every time you fold, you lose 0. Every time you go all in with aces, you win that small little bit of percent of the. So like if you have aces, I don't know how many percent is it, 0.4% or 0.3% of the time. So 0.3% of the time you just take down the pot, because if you have aces, people won't defend against you unless they have aces. So when you understand this concept, then the next concept, which we will probably talk more in a later call, is like position. And the reason the button generates more expected value than the first position or under the gun, which is the first position after the big blind, is that on the button, you have positional advantage and you can act after the other players act. And we probably need to this will be one of the topics that I'll write down for us to cover a lot deeper. Position, I think it's very crucial. But first and foremost, for the sake of this conversation, is that basically the other 4 players are splitting the blinds money with a certain frequency because the blinds are losing less than what they posted, because every decision that they make, they would be able to compensate and earn a little bit of extra EV. So the button will be earning slightly most, and kind of going a little bit too in depth for me to remember my third point. The third point is that I think this ties in really nicely to what we should discuss on our next call, and I'd like to know what you think about that. I think the next thing that we should discuss is how to play pre-flop, because it's a starting point for most poker players, and if they don't understand pre-flop and why they should play tighter in early position and looser in late position, they basically start with a very, very bad framework of how they can approach the game in general. So I think that's an easy thing for people to understand. So next session, I would like to cover basically pre-flop and position, which ties in close together. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I like what you did with the pocket aces model there, where once there's a dead pot, we can clearly generate EV with aces by just going all in. The simplest version of how we would play that hand pre-flop. It's not necessarily the most plus EV way to play that hand, but we can it really helps to make it clear how the existence of the blinds now give us a chance to actually make money with pocket aces. Because when he folds, there's actually money in the middle that we actually collect. I think it's going to be helpful to focus on position in the next call, because it probably has the biggest impact on pre-flop play of any other factor I could think of. The amount of players that are behind us and the amount of positions that we are away from the button, which is the hallmark of positional advantage, really dictates our positional playability, which is probably a term that we might want to introduce in the next call. We need something to be able to describe how our I'm trying not to define a word with a word, but how our realization and our bluff catching efficiency, all of the potential for capturing EV of our hand can be expressed in this word of playability. And position definitely helps our playability. Like you said, it gives us the option to act last, and we're always gaining more information when we act last. That's the most important thing to keep in mind. In any game, you'd always rather go second, I think, with the exception of maybe chess, where the first move is the advantage move. But in general, in games of information, in many games of information, I would say you benefit from being the one who gets to see the opponent act first. Poker is definitely one of those games.
Yeah, I mean, there's the other kind of games, right, where if it's the first person to reach a certain score or a certain target, the person that starts first has a significant advantage usually.
Mm-hmm. True.
It's kind of different depending on the rules of the game and the outcome. But anyway, I'm glad that we managed to find the next topic that we would like to talk about. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about this next time. See ya,
Yeah, this
Nick.
was really cool. Thanks, Wayne. See you next week.